Hello. In this video, I'm going to analyze some simple arguments for and against the claim that taxation is theft, and I'm going to argue that the argument against the claim is more compelling and succeeds in justifying its conclusion. In other words, I'm going to argue that taxation is not theft. Now, before I get into it, let's look at a simple libertarian argument. Now, not all libertarians would endorse this argument, nor would they necessarily express it in quite this way, but I think this sort of argument is often behind the libertarian perspective. Premise 1, taxation is theft. Premise 2, theft is wrong. Conclusion, so taxation is wrong. Now, they might restrict the first premise to a certain sort of taxation, for instance, redistributive taxation or progressive taxation, but I'm going to consider the general version that applies to all taxation whatsoever. We should note that we don't mean theft in the legal sense, or taking in a way that violates the laws. Why is that? Well, taxation clearly isn't theft in this sense. Our laws allow for taxation. Furthermore, if an evil dictator took us over and rewrote all the laws so that everything belongs to him, then taking stuff from him would be theft in the legal sense, but clearly that's not the sense that matters to morality. Okay? So by theft, in this argument, we mean something like taking in a way that violates people's rights, okay, according to the just theory of property rights. That's important. So now that we've clarified what we mean by taxation is theft, we're going to look at some arguments for and against this claim. But first, I want to look at some common ground between libertarians and their opponents. Okay? I think both libertarians, people who think that taxation is theft, and their opponents will agree to the following principle. Taxation is theft if and only if people have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation. Okay? This is a biconditional, an if and only if claim, so it's asserting that conditionals hold in both directions. Right? It's holding that taxation is theft if people have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation, and that's because if they really do have a right to it, then to take it from them is violating their rights, so it's theft. And then the other direction says taxation is theft only if people have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation, since if they don't have a right to it, then to take it from them is not violating their rights, and it's not theft. Okay? So I think both libertarians and their opponents will agree to this general principle. The difference is where we go from there. Okay? So let's use this general principle to generate two arguments, okay? Two dueling arguments, arguments for and against the same claim. First, the libertarian version. Premise 1. Taxation is theft if and only if people have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation. Premise 2. People have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation. Conclusion, so taxation is theft. Now let's look at the other version, or the statist version. Premise 1. Taxation is theft if and only if people have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation. Premise 2. People do not have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation. Conclusion, so taxation is not theft. Okay, so notice that these two arguments share the same first premise. They agree on this general principle. They just go in opposite directions from this principle. So the question is, which of these second premises is more plausible? Okay, these are both valid arguments. The premises entail the conclusion. So which conclusion we accept depends on which of these second premises we accept, assuming we're granting this general principle in the first premise. Let's look at these second premises, okay? The libertarian version says people have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation, and the statist version says people do not have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation. Now, looking at these premises, it might be tempting for the libertarian to say, look, L2 is the default position. The burden is on defending S2, right? If you're arguing that people do not have a right to it, then the burden is on you to defend that. However, both of these are claims that are being made. Both of these require defense. If you claim that God exists, the burden's on you. If you claim that God does not exist, the burden is on you. So I think it's just false that the burden is on the proponent of S2, but not also on the proponent of L2. I think it's tempting to see the current distribution of property as just default justified, and so any proposed deviation from it needs justification, but I think that's just a status quo bias that we've got no good reason to accept. So the question is, what are some factors that are relevant to the dispute between L2 and S2? Now I'm going to go through some challenges to premise L2. right? Some challenges to the idea that people do have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation. And each one of these challenges provides some support for S2, right? So they're both challenges to L2 and support for S2. First, people might consent to pay taxes, and if so, then they wouldn't have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation, right? So you might consent to things explicitly by vocally agreeing to it or signing something, but you also might consent to it implicitly by participating in a system, by not leaving, by not objecting, that sort of thing. Furthermore, you might think that what you do and do not have a right to is not only a function of what you actually consent to, but what you would consent to in certain hypothetical circumstances. For instance, if you were fully rational, or if you were behind a veil of ignorance and didn't know your eventual place in society, whether you'd be born into a rich family or a poor family, that sort of thing. And it seems pretty plausible that from such a position, we would choose a system in which we all cooperate to make sure that no one is left too badly off in society. Here's another factor that's relevant to this dispute. People might owe compensation for benefits they've received from society or for harms they've inflicted. Or even if they didn't inflict the harms themselves, they might have received benefits that are a result of harms that have occurred in the historical chain, right? Any of these factors might explain why people do not have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation, but instead owe some form of compensation, which is facilitated through taxes. Here's another factor that might be relevant. There might be some restrictions or conditions on property acquisition, since acquiring ownership over resources is essentially unilaterally excluding the rest of the world from using those resources. So the more you acquire ownership over resources, the more you owe as compensation for restricting the freedom of others, right? You owe it to others to make sure that everybody gets access to their fair share of the commons. And finally, there might be positive obligations of aid, right? You might just owe it to your fellow human to help them out when the cost to you is small and the benefit to them is great. And if that's true, then you might not have a right to what you would have in the absence of taxation. Now note that in order to defend L2, you're going to have to argue that every one of these challenges fails, right? Each one of these challenges is giving us a reason for thinking that you do not have a right to what you would have in the absence of taxation. And so in order to maintain L2, that we do have a right to it, you're going to have to argue that all of these challenges fail. Whereas to defend S2, all you're going to have to argue is that at least one of these challenges succeeds, right? At least one of these things gives us a good reason for thinking that people do not have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation. And so that's why I think S2 is a lot more plausible than L2, right? There's a lot of good reasons for thinking that people do not have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation, okay? In my view, all of these are pretty plausible. But remember, all you need is at least one to challenge L2. So let's look back at the two arguments, okay? We have the libertarian version and the statist version. Now, if you're a libertarian who endorses this first argument, you have to acknowledge that your conclusion that taxation is theft relies on this crucial assumption L2. People have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation. Now, in my experience, this assumption is rarely even made explicit, let alone defended. And it is something that needs to be defended if you are to justify the claim that taxation is theft. Now, in my own view, I think the second argument is a lot more compelling, and that's because I think the second premise is pretty compelling in light of the considerations we looked at before. There are many reasons for thinking that people do not have a right to what they would have in the absence of taxation, and all you need is one compelling one to justify that claim, okay? So, I think this second argument justifies its conclusion that taxation is not theft. But if you think this first argument is more compelling, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. And now it begins.